Well, welcome back. This is week 5 of Roots of Modern Thought, Life Pacific College's course on philosophy with a focus on postmodern thought. How we gotten to where we're at is really the question in this class. And in the brief 8 weeks that we have together online here, we're looking at the thought forms that are dominant in our times and the evolution of philosophical thought as it has led us to these times. That's a lot to take on. There's a lot of information in the course. I really want to encourage you in your hard work and diligence in this course. Keep at it. It's worth the journey. This week we're going to talk about epistemology. How do we know what we know? And I've asked you at the beginning of the course, and hopefully you've done it, if not, do it soon, to watch a clip as an illustration of the issue of reality and how we know what we know and how we can trust in knowing that the reality that we are encountering and living in is actually the reality that is true and real. I've chosen a movie based on the novel by the same title, Cormac McCarthy's work, No Country for Old Men. The clip that you're going to watch is a very interesting moment in time in the development of a story of a drug deal gone bad, a hunter played by Josh Brolin who takes the money that he finds in this terrible scene at the beginning of the movie and runs with it. He's then chased throughout the movie by the Mexican cartel who is invested in those funds and hires a hitman, Anton Chigurh, played by great actor Javier Bardem, in this scene, who is en route to finding Josh Brolin's character, stops for a tank of gas and has an interesting conversation with an otherwise fairly simple-minded service station attendant. And in that encounter, in that conversation, I want you to pick up on and pay close attention to the dialogue and what's being said, because though we don't have the time in this session to get into a full analysis of the clip, it's clearly a moment in time where two people coming from two very different walks of life are having two very different conversations simultaneously and together around the mechanics of getting a tank of gas and the weather. And what I want you to observe is how many layers of the conversation exist. Anton Chigurh, the psychopathic killer, really speaking of the ultimates in life and the meaning of this stranger's life and his ability at any given moment to take that life even on the flip of a coin. And then the more simple-minded person behind the counter, excellently played by a great character actor, trying to figure out what kind of moment am I having here. Very existential kind of moment in the movie. I picked the movie because Joel and Ethan Coen, who are great directors, producers, movie makers, auteur-type directors, are capturing what I think is one dramatic example of the way that people are thinking and interacting these days, and are reflecting, these things back to us in the work that they offer us. The book itself, Cormac McCarthy's work, is a great novel to read. I would encourage you to read anything by McCarthy. But this book is in title a reference to an old W.B. Yeats poem called Sailing to Byzantium, where the literary allusion of the title and the content of the story is that the good old days, quite literally, in Constantinople in the Byzantine period, where a Christian civilization had risen in the eastern portion of the Roman Empire and broken off from the collapsing Roman Empire and really embodied the ideals not only of the Christian worldview but of Plato's Academy, the classical philosopher Plato's school of thought, where the substance of life and the significance of life and the values of love and hope and faith were on full display. Those days are gone, Cormac McCarthy is saying in this novel and in this movie, and we are left now with the disintegrating reality of a world gone far off the foundation of Christian idealism, let alone Platonic kind of aspirations. That's a lot to think about and a lot of literary and philosophical reference, I know. But the point is that, when we think about how we know what we know, how is it that we know? What is knowledge exactly? How can we trust it? How can we be justified in knowing that our beliefs, as over against some other belief system, is actually a reflection of reality? This is the business of epistemology. And so all of this is an important and relevant subcategory of philosophy to consider with regard to answering the question of this class, which is, how have we gotten to where we've gotten? All the categories of philosophy from the ancient classical Greek period have shifted, changed, morphed, become different and more complex than they were at the beginning. Part of that would be expected, but some of it is a result of the sweeping shifts and changes and incredibly powerful forces of human evolution and culture and society, and the changes, the convolutions and painful upheavals of a Western society fighting for its own survival, and how that's changed our consciousness. I've argued from the beginning of the course that people be today very different than they used to be yesterday, poor grammar notwithstanding. That the way we think and process and feel and communicate, and our perspectives, our perception, everything about who we be's is shifted. And it's shifted along some specific lines. And we've talked in analyzing those lines how post or late modern thought process is not only in some ways deeply in error, although in others greatly helpful in its questioning of authority and its challenging of the norms, but it's also in key distinctives antithetical, opposed to a Christian worldview. We need to understand that we live in times that perceive reality very differently than a Christian worldview might invite you to perceive it. And in the conflict between the perceptions, we find both opportunity and challenge, right? And that's really what we're trying to get at in this class. So as we discover this week more about how philosophers think, about how we use our senses, how information comes to us, how we experience that which we perceive to be real, we ask some very foundational and key questions. Again, I mentioned some of the benefits of postmodernism, and I'll give you an example of one of the benefits in postmodern's kind of propensity for questioning reality. There's a lot of information to cover here, and if you're interested in this kind of an illustration, I would point you to another book called The Future of the Mind by Michio Kaku. He talks about, he's a very interesting character, very funny, very brilliant, kind of theoretical physicist. What is going on with neuroscience and the exploration of the human mind as one of the last great frontiers of science, and how we think about this business of how we know what we know from the neurological reality of our neurosystems, centered, of course, in the human brain. The illustration I want to offer to you about reality and how we perceive it is a simple one that Michio Kaku references in his book, and it's the construction of the eye. We think that what we see is what we get as we exercise the privilege of our eyesight in perceiving the world around us. But the truth is that the construction of the eye itself, trying to keep it as simple as possible, is a lot more complex and deceptive than one might think. If you can picture the eyeball as a kind of a chamber, a sort of movie theater turned backwards, you begin to get a sense of the mechanics of the eye. Light enters the retina and does a certain kind of a dance inside the chamber of our eyeball relative to our field of vision and our retina, and a little place in the back of the eyeball called the fovea. And what we don't realize is that two things are true about eyesight immediately from a purely physiological or biological level. One is that we don't actually see everything that we think we're seeing. That in the middle of our vision there's a blank spot, a dark spot, a blind spot. That is the reflection on our retina of the optic nerve buried deep within our eyeball chamber. Our brain, our subconscious brain, papers over that blank spot by collecting up information surrounding it and providing us an image that is a representation of reality, but some might argue is really a wallpapered fake kind of illusion. Another thing that's true about the interaction of light within our eyeball is that really what we only see clearly is the center of the field of vision around that blank spot, and the rest of our horizon of vision is very blurry. We experience that because our eye is conserving energy in the translation of visual imagery to our brain in information chunks that our brain can make sense of. What happens in all of that is that our internal eye at various levels rapidly vibrates to create a recollection of visual information, to fill in that little hole in our vision, and also to clarify everything else that we see based on the clarity ring that is around that hole. That's called saccades. The rapid eye movement, especially internally, is called saccades. That's what our neurological system is doing to help our visionary collection system do all that it needs to do. All that to say is that the images that we see are quite literally manufactured by our eye and brain and translated for us into information that says this is reality. Some folks, I don't, but some folks might argue that that is all an illusion, that actually we're not seeing what we think we're seeing. And there's a huge set of philosophical schools and arguments about all of that that bring into question, what is it that we actually are doing when we're using our senses, our five senses, eyesight, hearing, taste, touch, and so on, to encounter, interpret the world? Is it as simple as what you see is what you get? Some would argue no, it's not. And now we're off to the races. That's an illustration of a postmodern way, honestly, of thinking about, well, what if there is more to all of this that we presume to be true that affects our ability to perceive and understand and comprehend the actual reality or truth of our existence? That's not at all a meaningless or kind of arbitrary conversation. That's a very important set of questions to ask in light of the physiological facts of our senses and our condition as human beings. But it still doesn't change, we would argue as Christians, the ultimate reality of reality, the ultimate truth and objective nature of what it is that we understand exists outside of ourselves. So in all of that, you get the idea that there is quite a lot to talk about and explore as philosophers with regard to this business of answering the question, how do we know what we know? I hope that that wasn't too much information. I know that you can take it all in and begin to process it. In fact, I hope, like me, you find it incredibly interesting to begin to consider the implications of this kind of philosophical discussion. But when we talk about epistemology, how we know what we know, this is the kind of thing that we're talking about. Getting to the root of how it is that we perceive what is actually real and true in our lives. The way this is done, the process of forming opinions and perspectives, again, has shifted and changed from the classical days. And we'll talk about in the book and in other places how those shifts and who those shifts have been driven by. Immanuel Kant especially, but others who are primary in shaping and challenging the way that we understand these really critical and foundational things. So I hope you enjoy this week's content. I hope, like me, you're excited about it, you get into it. Let me know if you have any questions or issues or challenges along the way. I'm happy to help. Thanks for tuning in.